I'm here in the grounds of Hartlebury Castle with Paul West, who is the former Chief Constable of West Mercia Police and also the Chair of Trustees of Hartlebury Castle. Paul, it's a glorious day. We've had a bit of a shower that we've so far just avoided, but tell us a little bit about this absolutely glorious building, which, you know, it's not my... it's not what I expect to see in a castle. You know, it's why is it a castle, and what? Tell us a little bit about the history behind this as Chair of Trustees.
The first thing to say is welcome, and welcome to Hartlebury Castle. And I wish I had £1 for every time I've said that in the last 2 or 3 years. I'm a former Chief Constable, and one thing I've discovered since retiring is that there is a life after policing, although I'm still very much connected to policing in the criminal justice system. So, Hartlebury Castle, we're here in Worcestershire. As you say, it's sunny now. It was absolutely teeming down just a short moment ago, but it is a beautiful site. And Hartlebury Castle historically was the home of the Bishops of Worcester. The site's been here for over 1,000 years, and I'm not sure how many bishops have lived here with their families, and back in the day there were single men and fighting men. The bishops back in the early 1300s weren't really as bishops we recognise today. So for over 1,000 years the successive bishops of Worcester lived here, up until 15 years ago when you know, it's very grand and it's beautiful, but it's not exactly a family home. So the church commissioners decided they would sell the castle. The castle has inside a unique thing which is called a Herd Library. The library was established by Bishop Herd in the 1700s. He was a great book collector, and when he was appointed here as Bishop of Worcester, he brought a huge book collection with him, and there was nowhere to put it. So he built a very special room to host his collection of books, and it's been there ever since. And the point about the Herd Library, as it's called, is that it's not just the books in the room, it's the room itself. So when the decision was made to sell the castle, there was real concerns locally, because it's quite a well-kept secret, or it had been a well-kept secret about the library, real concerns that the library would be lost, not just the castle, but the library and the heritage, because it's unique. It's the only Anglican Bishop's Library anywhere, which is still in the room that was actually built for it, and it would be lovely to think I might be able to show you it later on.
Let's see if we can and look forward to that. But it doesn't look like a castle. So other than the feature
Yes.
above at the first floor level, that you know, was that there at the start, or was that?
Right, no, and that feature is called a crenellation. I only know that because I've learnt that as well. No, that was added in the 1700s to sort of make it look a little bit more like a castle. But again, back in time, when the church was very wealthy and very influential in the country, bishops had multiple residences. They could choose to live wherever they wanted. They all had at least one pad in London, various country homes. Here there was a home in the city of Worcester, and this was the jewel in the crown, if you like. So this
was the grand property.
It was a grand property, and hence the name, the castle, to distinguish it from the halls and manors and this sort of thing. And in 1700, I guess it was a bit slow off the mark, but one of the bishops decided he should make it look a bit more like a castle by adding those crenellations.
He's certainly achieved that. Let's take a walk round the grounds now, and as we go, we're going to focus more on policing matters. So, for example, as a former Chief Constable, just in the news over the past few days, here in England and Wales, down the steps. There's been.
First, because it's a bit narrow.
You carry on. There's been some comment by a serving chief about the policing governance structure in England and Wales, and the way in which the Home Secretary is choosing to comment on and exercise her a degree of leverage over what might be seen as operational matters, the Chief Constable's responsibility. You know, you as a a chief of West Mercia for 8 years. You'll, I'm sure, have a perspective on this. What do you think about the recent pushback that we've had from, I think, chiefs more generally, actually, not just a single chief, and also actually again here in England and Wales, about now the governance landscape, where we have about 70% of the police and crime commissioners in a single party, the Conservative Party, the same party as the Home Secretary.
Yeah, I mean, I know the purpose of this conversation is to look forward, Bernard. I could talk forever on police governance and the various flaws in the current model and the mistakes that have been made in recent years. I don't want to do that. But what I will say is that when I became a chief constable, there was something in this country that was called the tripartite system, and it was often symbolised by a triangle or a three-legged stool, all of which were equal. It was an equilateral triangle, and a stool with legs that were the same length. And one of these symbolised the chief constable, one the Home Secretary, and one what were then called police authorities, which were local bodies of a collection of people representing the local community. And that tripartite system was something of which British policing was incredibly proud and was admired worldwide. Actually, I've done a lot of international work, and I have got a lot of interest in international policing matters throughout my whole career and beyond since retiring. And that tripartite model was, I say, it was admired the world over, largely because it avoided political interference, and it also avoided any one party in that balance being primary. Now that doesn't exist anymore, and let's be positive and look to the future. I think any future policing model of governance that's going to be effective in holding chief constables to account locally has to somehow reintroduce that concept of there being three parties in this balance. One's the chief constable, one is the government, which is personified by the Home Secretary, and the other is the local population, which currently is personified by one individual, the Police and Crime Commissioner, and I would argue that that's a very flawed model. But basically, looking to the future, I think we need to remind ourselves that that model, which had been in existence for many years and was admired across the world, where many countries have seen very direct political interference in policing and central direction, that three-cornered model, chief constable, government, local community, we need to breathe new life into that and enhance what currently exists to reproduce that, but in a different way.
There's the Home Office here is undertaking a review of police and crime commissioners. They've published already their first report. They have a second report yet to come. So there is work in progress on aspects of this, and indeed it's possible that PCCs, police and crime commissioners, may take on more of them. Fire governance, there's talk of responsibility for criminal justice as well, but it does seem that we are firmly wedded to the what is broadly called the 43 force model. It's debatable whether it's actually 43. We can add a few more to that. Thoughts on what might be done at the margin. In other words, things that might in some way be reflected in that part 2, and thoughts as to here in England and Wales whether 43 is the right number. In Scotland they had 8 and went down to 1. Should we have fewer?
So there's quite a lot of questions in
there
one
are.
there. Yes. I'm going to take the first one first, which was thoughts on the review of police and crime commissioners. When I was serving, there was a very sort of trendy theme which has continued, where anything that you did in policing or in the public sector, you were asked, where's your equality impact assessment? That was the immediate response from any inspectorate, any inspecting body, where's your equality impact assessment? The point being that any change in policy should not have a detrimental effect on any protected minorities. So when the proposal to introduce police and crime commissioners first came along, when I was still serving, my question to the government is, where's your equality impact assessment? You know, you've been asking us for long enough, where's yours? Of course there wasn't one, and the upshot of that is that 9 years later, surprise surprise, the governance of policing, which was performed by a collective group of people and across the country, up to 1,000 people across the country in different local bodies, overnight that was swept away, and 9 years ago we had 100% white, 85% male, single person overseeing policing. So the diversity of police governance just completely disappeared.
And that stays the same pretty much to today. The latest elections, it's not a particularly diverse group, the elected PCCs.
I would suggest it's worse, Bernard, because you know, we're 9 years on, for heaven's sake. If people took, and I'm talking here, you know, government at the highest level, if they took diversity of police governance seriously, then 9 years on somebody would have done something about reintroducing genuine accountability to people with different life experiences. I mean, right now, you know, I'm a middle-aged, hopefully still, white male, you're the same. I can't change who I am, and neither should I need to apologise for who I am, but in terms of discharging my role as a chief constable, I need to make myself accountable to my communities. How can I possibly do that realistically through one single individual representing a population, in this case, of 1.2 million people spread over hundreds, well, thousands of square miles? So this whole thing about diversity, I think it's worse. 9 years on, we now have 2 PCCs from a minority ethnic background.
I think it's just one.
It
depends on whether you count the Mayor of London as well.
Right, it's a very small number. We have still a relatively small number of female PCCs. We have an increasing number, thankfully, of female chiefs, but more than half the police forces in this country currently, their senior leadership and governance are 2 white middle-aged males. Now that cannot be in any way described as effective governance or representation.
So an opportunity then somehow to improve significantly on diversity where it's gone backwards, and consequentially on community representation and possibly engagement. But to the point,
you know, this is looking forward. I'm not arguing for a return of what was. What I'm saying is that if this much heralded review of PCCs is worth anything and is serious, it needs to address this diversity point, and it needs to address effective local representation, because there are bodies currently called police and crime panels, which were introduced at the same time as PCCs, and you know, they've been described as toothless tigers. I mean, without being disrespectful, they're toothless mice, or you know, they really do not have the sort of leverage that is needed, both on behalf of the communities to hold chief constables to account, but also actually to hold police and crime commissioners to account.
And indeed, some PCCs.
Can you see the castle incident?
Well, yes. Let's just change the angle here for a moment or two. That and some PCCs seem to disregard the police and crime panel. It can be quite difficult for the police and crime panel actually to exert any oversight of the work of the police and crime commissioner. But let's just move from that then to currently 43 forces. In Scotland it's gone from 8 forces to 1. If we go back to, and I'm sure you can remind me of the approximate date, but a former Home Secretary, Charles Clarke, was keen on there being significantly fewer forces. I think it was of the order of a dozen from 43, so significant mergers.
That was in 2005, when I at that point had been Chief Constable for 2 years here in West Mercia. And the argument was based upon the police service's inability nationally to deal with serious and organised crime that crossed force boundaries, which is a very genuine argument and a very worthwhile thing to pursue. But unfortunately, the Home Secretary at the time, had a plan, commissioned a report, and never in my service or my life have I seen a report published on a Friday, accepted in full by the government, and moving towards implementation on a Monday, literally over a weekend. Many government reports sort of reports to government sink without trace, don't they? But this was notable in that it was fully accepted and moved towards implementation within the space of 3 days, which sort of hinted that there was a predetermined outcome.
And that would have, from memory, swept away West Mercia, Staffordshire, West Midlands, Warwickshire, maybe Gloucestershire, although but certainly a very substantial number of forces here into a single force. And in broader terms, half a dozen forces being consolidated into a single one across the country.
Yeah, absolutely. And in this area, it was actually West Mercia, West Midlands, Staffordshire, and Warwickshire, which would have come together in a sort of West Midlands super force, if I can describe it in those terms, which would have been the second largest force in the country beyond the Metropolitan Police. And there are arguments in favour of changing the nature, changing the size, changing the whole landscape of policing, and I've never felt anything other than that. But what I have felt is that, and that was a classic example, somebody, in this case it was a Home Secretary, came along with a predetermined outcome which they sought to implement without any thought of the impacts for local communities and local people. It basically made the Home Secretary's job easier. That was the motivation at the time, and it was nothing more than that. It was sort of couched on the report about serious and organised crime. But
I remember at the time there was a significant outcry, pretty much across policing, against that, and indeed the decision was reversed. I can't recall the detail, but the point, I think the motivation for that was the recognition that, which is reflected here in England and Wales with the strategic policing requirements, that there are some policing activities that naturally fall into national responsibilities, and we have one or two national agencies that reflect that. Firearms capabilities, there are some of the smaller forces that their firearms capabilities are more limited and can be more stretched. We see instances where there is mutual aid, and so forces collaborate in order to support, for example, the policing of the G7 summit approaching in Cornwall. In your time, Warwickshire and West Mercia discussed collaboration, and indeed whilst Warwickshire West Mercia didn't merge, you did come to an agreement which was more recently unwound by the Police and Crime Commissioners for Warwickshire and West Mercia. What's your perspective on that unwinding of the work that your then force and Warwickshire did back in around 2010, 2011?
Yeah, I mean this was really the ultimate working out of Charles Clarke's failed plan, if you like, of police force mergers. And many people, including myself, had talked about, there's nothing magic about the number 43. Nobody was saying that we should stay as we are, but what we were arguing for was a greater degree of formal collaboration in key areas. So when Charles Clarke actually was fired as Home Secretary, John Reid came in then as Home Secretary, and his first act, literally on his first day in office, was to stop the whole thing, because it had been, it was one man's dream basically, and John Reid could see that. So when that whole agenda went away overnight, we'd already done a lot of work in the region here to think, okay, if this does happen, how can we model it and how can we shape it in a way that's going to benefit our communities and is going to work efficiently? So having done a lot of that preparatory work, the ultimate result was, in West Mercia's case and Warwickshire, And by this time, none of these things happen overnight, Bernard, so by this time I was sort of in my last few months of service and retiring, and my successor David Shaw, who had been the deputy in West Mercia, had by then been selected to take on the role as chief. So I wasn't directly involved in that whole process, so I can comment sort of dispassionately, if you like, objectively, but I was in favour of some enhanced model of collaboration, whatever that looked like. Now, I read something very recently. I don't want to attribute it to any one individual. I wish I could remember who said it, because I remember feeling really incensed at the time, and it was somebody who should know better. But anyway, who described chief constables as being very competitive, and this was connected to the reintroduction of policing targets, which is currently being discussed and being proposed by the Home Secretary. We'll go that way. This could be very wet. It's been very rainy here recently, but
we've both got
right.
hopefully suitable footwear on.
Yeah. So, you know, I read this thing, chief constables are very competitive. I thought, they just don't understand it. You know, we're not competitive. Yes, we're professional. We all want to achieve the best for our communities. But, you know, I don't want to see policing in Staffordshire, for example, then, you know, deteriorating while it gets better here, or you know, we're all professional police officers. In fact, most of us have served in different parts of the country. So we're collaborative, we're not competitive. But one of the difficulties with Police and Crime Commission, I think, to be fair, it would have been the same with police authorities. You know, you have local people doing their best to represent very varied communities with all sorts of different challenges, and if they feel that the hard-earned council tax, part of which goes towards funding policing locally, if they feel that that is going outside the force area, then you can understand, you know, the argument to say, well, hang on, surely we shouldn't be doing this.
Yes.
And I think in simplistic terms that's been the thinking of the PCCs in rowing back from the model.
So not wanting to disadvantage or be seen as disadvantaging local policing, even if there is a very substantial benefit to either other forces or indeed policing nationally.
Yeah, so, absolutely. But you know, there are all sorts of unforeseen consequences of these arrangements, and I, you know, without commenting positively or negatively on the strategic alliance, having retired and I still kept my network going, you know, I would speak to officers and staff, police staff from West Mercia. This is long before the days of Zoom video conferencing, who were travelling 50 miles to attend a meeting in Warwickshire, and they were passing officers and staff from Warwickshire travelling 50 miles in the opposite direction to attend meetings at Hindley, which is the West Mercia headquarters. So, you know, bigger, especially in rural communities, if you like, in the county, bigger can also involve an awful lot of wasted time and travel. So for all of the advantages of economies of scale you get, there's always a downside. You know, it's the old Newton's laws of motion, which you as a former physicist will appreciate.
Guilty as charged.
To every action there is an equal and opposite reaction. So yeah, that's life, I'm afraid, you know.
So your life now, you've I think always had a passion for music and the orchestra. Moving away from, well, actually no, staying to a degree with policing for reasons that I'll explain in a sentence or two. You're a keen violinist. I have no idea, Paul. I've never heard you play, so I don't know your proficiency. But you have a passion for the orchestra, the police here in, I think I'm right in saying, in England and Wales, rather than wider, including Scotland, have a police orchestra. Is it a British police orchestra?
It is, yes. So it does incorporate Scotland and Northern Ireland. It's the British Police Symphony Orchestra. And just going back to my proficiency as a violinist, I'll let you judge for yourself, but basically I've been playing the violin for over 50 years, so if I wasn't any good, I should have given up long before.
Well, yes, people would have told you by now.
Yes,
and
exactly.
I'll look forward to that a little later today. But
getting back to the orchestra. So the British Police Symphony Orchestra was established about 32 years ago now. We celebrated our 30th anniversary with a wonderful charity gala concert in the Albert Hall, almost exactly 2 years ago now, thankfully, before the pandemic came along and the ability to stage large events was no longer possible. And that charity gala was attended by chief officers from every force in the United Kingdom and many chief constables, and it was just a fantastic event to celebrate the orchestra's 30 years. So the purpose of the orchestra, yes, it's to make music and for members to enjoy themselves and to give performances, to give pleasure to others, but much more than that, it's about representing the police service in a different way, and in a way that can connect with people, which music can, that almost no other method is able to do. You can do visits, you can give lectures, you can invite ride-alongs and all of this sort of thing, but music's an international language, and a lot of people, through no fault of their own, just don't have access to live music. I'm talking here orchestral live music, but any live music. And of course we've all been starved of that. It's been one of the
this last year, absolutely.
Yeah, I know, and so many professional musicians have, their whole income's dried up, and so anyway, the idea of the orchestra was for us to be ambassadors for the police service, to connect with people, particularly for whom access to live music is outside of their experience. So here we're thinking about a number of marginalised groups. We've done work with children with young adults with learning disabilities, elderly people in residential homes, some very, very challenging schools in difficult areas of the country. It's all about taking music out and presenting the police service in a way that is very different perhaps from their normal lived experience. If you live in a I'll not name a particular area of the country, but if you're in a very challenging inner city estate and all you ever see of the police is confrontational, to suddenly realise that these people, we're just going to walk down the drive and then we'll come back in. Okay?
That's fine, although I think we're coming to a close fairly shortly, so I'm tempted to actually draw
loop back.
Yes, absolutely. So let's head back. Let's just head down here, not to go in where it says no entry.
I'm the trustee, we can
well,
go.
no. What I think we'll do is we'll get to the no entry sign, and we'll pause just there, and but sorry, I interrupted you. You were saying about
just finishing off. Yeah. So we can present a side of policing that is very different from the confrontational, out on the streets police officer, and for people who haven't a very positive image of the police service to see that actually we're humans. We're just normal
Absolutely.
people. We may wear uniforms, and for some of these events, obviously I'm now retired, but those who are still serving officers will go in uniform. We have very colourful t-shirts that the rest of us wear, and the scheme is called Play Out.
Yes.
And it's about taking music out on behalf of the police service in a way that we can be true ambassadors and just present policing in a different way. And it's a fantastic project, which is one of the elements of the British Police Symphony Orchestra that we're all particularly proud of.
And what you were saying there is also for me at the heart of the Policing Friendship Tour, and this is part of the Policing Friendship Tour. Police officers, police staff, from chief constables through to PCSOs, those who are specials, volunteers, and the wider policing family, suppliers, academia, third sector. We're all human beings. We all have our own particular challenges, and one of the final question I typically ask of those that I'm talking to is we're looking to support on this tour a range of charities, relevant charities. Tell me what your charity, Paul, is going to be.
Well, it will be the British Police Symphony Orchestra's play-out scheme. So this isn't to support the orchestra giving fancy concerts, far from it. This is to support small groups from the orchestra in their own time and at their own expense, taking live music into areas where we believe we can make a difference, a positive difference on behalf of the police service in breaking down barriers in communities where traditionally the relationships haven't been strong. So we call that play out. Typically, if we have a concert coming up, because members of the orchestra travel literally from all over the United Kingdom to get together on weekends and to give concerts, so typically we'll do one of these play out sessions on the Friday, the day before the concert the next day. So yeah, that's the charity that I'm very appreciative of the offer. So it's a sort of subdivision of the BPSO, the British Police Symphony Orchestra, our play out scheme.
Brilliant. So British Police Symphony Orchestra play out scheme. Paul, thank you so much for the tour of Hartlebury Castle. Thank you so much for your perspective on a number of the issues facing policing today and how they might move forward. I'm just going to turn the camera to, although I appreciate with your authority we could press on beyond the no entry sign, but we've got here the view of the entrance, and thank you once again.
Well, thank you, and thank you for visiting, and I really appreciated it and enjoyed it. Thank you.
Likewise.